Hi everyone, welcome. I see a few of you joining. Welcome everybody. Hi. My name is Maggie Riley. I am the Immigration Law and Policy Analyst for Boundless Immigration, and we're going to get started in just a couple minutes here with this month's edition of Lunch with a Lawyer. So we'll be talking about a couple reports that dropped in the past week. We've had the new Visa Bulletin come out for July. We've had the NBC Backlog report come out for June. And we'll be talking a bit about the F2A family preference category and how it relates to Visa Bulletin and NBC Backlog reports. So hi, welcome everybody. I'm going to just give a minute here to let a few more people join us before we get started. It's nice to see all of you today. Hi, welcome everybody. It's great to see you all joining. Wonderful to get to chat with all of you today. For those of you who've just joined in the past minute or so, my name is Maggie Riley. I'm the Immigration Law and Policy Analyst at Boundless Immigration. I am an immigration lawyer by training, and I work at Boundless Immigration, keeping everybody up to date on what's going on in immigration law and policy, and to help us all stay on top of what exactly is happening out there. So today we are going to be talking about some new reports that just dropped for the Visa Bulletin, which finally moved a little bit for some folks who've been waiting. We're also going to talk about the NBC Backlog report that just came out this week and how that relates to some of these backlogs in the family-based immigration category specifically. So, welcome everybody, and let's go ahead and get started. So first off the bat, I always have to give a little spiel that though I am an immigration lawyer, I only work for Boundless, and so anything that I'm saying today is not legal advice. This is general information. A lot of what we're going to talk about is actually based on the data the government releases. And so it's public data, but often it's really difficult to read. And so I'm just going to translate for you, and we can talk about sort of how this impacts what you guys are seeing out there as far as any applications you might also have pending. So I have been working at Boundless for a couple years. I like to talk about immigration and share what I know about that with you. And today that's going to be Visa Bulletin and Backlog related. These are topics that come up for a lot and for very good reason. The family-based immigration system is a bit of a confusing structure, and for those of you who are in the system, you are probably already aware of this. Have a little bit of a shaky connection here. I see a couple of people rejoining. I do apologize about that. So I was just about to jump in and start talking about the family-based immigration system and how the Visa Bulletin impacts that. So when you're immigrating into the United States, if you're coming from outside the country, you're probably dealing with the Department of State and the National Visa Center, which is an administrative office set up under the purviews of the Department of State to help them gather documents from visa and green card applicants and to schedule interviews with the U.S. embassies and consulates overseas. The government only allows a certain number of green cards to be granted across family-based and business immigration each year. And this number sits at 226,000. Anytime family-based green cards aren't used up for the year, they roll over to the employment-based side. Some of you may remember a lot of reporting at the end of 2021. There was a huge uproar because the government, after the pandemic, did not process a lot of applications during the pandemic. And so because of that, even though there was a large number of green cards that should have been available for people to immigrate through family members, such as the F2A, which is spouses and children of legal permanent residents, F1, adult children of U.S. citizens, all these various different categories that should have been able to immigrate, missed out on their opportunity to get an interview for their green card because so many of the consulates and embassies were closed during the pandemic. As we moved through the pandemic, we did see a lot of these consulates begin to reopen. However, the backlogs, which were already high before the pandemic, continued to rise as people continued to submit applications during this time. So by the time we got to 2021, unfortunately, there was a huge waste in green cards. In terms of the family-based green cards, only 65,452 family-based green cards were issued in fiscal year 2021. So the fiscal year, just to clarify, is a little different from the calendar year that many of us are familiar that runs January to December. Your fiscal year is what the government uses as their annual calendar, and that's going to end on September 30th. So the fiscal year runs then from October to September of each year. So in October of 2021, the year ended, and only 65,452 family-based green cards had been given out, even though there were 226,000 green cards that should have been available. Those green cards that were not used, that additional 135,000, even more than that, 60,000 green cards, should have rolled over to the employment-based sector, but unfortunately, for the same reasons that those interviews weren't scheduled for family-based folks, they also weren't scheduled for the employment-based green cards. So there was a huge number of people who should have been eligible to get their green cards last year who were not able to. So this also leads into a little bit talking about the Visa Bulletin. So as I mentioned earlier, the Visa Bulletin deals with several categories of people and the order in which the government gives them preference or priority to immigrate to the United States with a green card. So an immigrant visa is what the Department of State refers to for green cards, so that one can enter the U.S. after they've gone through the entire process, post-interview, for example. These immigrant visas, of course, are going to be, as I mentioned, only 226,000 per year. And from there, there's obviously many more people applying than there are green cards available. So the people who have to wait, who don't get one of those 226,000 cards, are sorted into preference categories. And in the family-based context, there are 5 categories generally. You're going to have the F1, F2, second preference category, which is the F2A. You're also going to have F2B, F3, and F4. So for today, we're going to talk about the F2A category specifically, at least to start out, because this is one that's been very interesting. F2A is part of the second preference category, so it's still in that family-based category, but F2A are the spouses and children of green card holders. And in immigration law, children is going to mean an unmarried person under age 21. So spouses and children of green card holders in this F2A category usually also had to wait for green cards to become available and priority dates to become current, just like the other categories of family-based visas. However, in the summer of 2019, we did have something unusual happen, which is that category became current on the Visa Bulletin. And what that means is that there is not a priority date in the past that has to become current for you to apply for your actual green card. And so what ended up happening is that frequently, or usually, if the Visa Bulletin moves forward, it's by a couple of weeks, maybe it's a couple of months. In the case of the F2A category, it became current and has remained current now for over 2 years. So at this point, we're coming up on almost 3 years, actually, that the F2A category has been current. And the reason for that, especially in the wake of the pandemic, are these really large numbers of unmet green card grants that have not been going out. So people, there was a slight drop in applications. The government didn't issue as many green cards. And now they're in a situation where they're trying to get people to get through the process, pull them out of these visa backlogs, and get them immigrated to the country. Unfortunately, the consulates have not had the staffing to rise to the task. So despite the fact that many, many people around the world, and the Department of State does estimate that in the total visa backlog, so not just green cards, but in the total visa backlog, they're looking at something like 4 million people. In the immigrant visa category, we're looking at over 400,000 people who are waiting to get their green card interviews. And we will talk about that a little bit more. But for these people who were waiting that should have been able to do an interview because the priority date was now current for them, unfortunately, because those interviews were never scheduled during the pandemic and that increased the backlog following the pandemic, we've seen this continue on where a lot of people are still waiting to get interviews despite that current priority date. And of course, at the end of each calendar year, any green cards that are not granted by the government or given out essentially disappear. And so without congressional action to what they call recapture immigrant visas or recapture green cards, unfortunately, once we get to the end of September, any cards unused are lost to us. So of course there is this very strong onus on the government to speed it up, to get some more of these processed, but unfortunately we're really not seeing the movement we'd like to see. So discussing the NVC green card backlog, that was just released earlier this week, and Boundless did release its updated NVC backlog report earlier today. And unfortunately, what we discovered is that though the number of interviews that were scheduled in for this coming month of June, or the month that we're in now, excuse me, it did increase very marginally. But when we did the math on it, it actually came out to less than a 0.5 percentage point increase over last month. So the NVC this month scheduled 28,545 interviews. Last month, they scheduled 28,400 and something interviews. So we're talking about a really, really, really small increase in the number of overall interviews that have been scheduled. Because of this, the backlog at the NVC for immigrant visas actually increased by more than 5,000 cases. And looking at the data going back for the last year to June of 2021, and when we are looking at this NVC data, we can really see that though some months they've increased their interview rate, though some months they've fallen a little behind, they're really sitting between about 25,000 and 32,000 interviews a month. Unfortunately, however, if we go back and look at the data from before the pandemic, the NVC used to be scheduling 60,866 interviews a month. So right now we're looking at a backlog that is 7 times what we were seeing in 2019. So unfortunately, despite the fact that the Visa Bulletin is current for F2A, despite the fact that there are some consulates where we are starting to see movement and we are getting people through the process into the country, we are still seeing, I don't want to say they're dragging their feet. I do believe it's an honest, there are serious staffing issues, but we're really not seeing the kind of aggressive action that we need at the NVC and the State Department to start clearing these backlogs and getting people moving. As I touched on, as we approach the end of the year on September 30th, the end of the fiscal year, the government is increasingly running out of time to process more of these immigrant visas, get these green cards approved so that they don't get wasted like they did in 2021. And so on that note, I have been talking a lot about the Visa Bulletin, and I did want to jump back to that and just touch on some of the big changes that we saw. So the Visa Bulletin does come out every month. It's published by the Department of State, and it tells us for family-based immigrants and for employment-based immigrants when these various categories the government has divided everybody into can expect to begin their green card application process after they've started the initial paperwork. And so at Boundless, we largely are working with family-based immigrants, and so that's why I've been discussing the F2A, spouses and children of green card holders, up until now. Family-based, of course, also covers the F1 category, which is unmarried children aged 21 and older of U.S. citizens. And those folks we are still seeing, they're not current on their priority dates, but we did see movement of between 6 and 7 weeks on several of the countries in this category. Unfortunately, the Philippines did not see any change in their cutoff date, but Mexico, India, and China all saw changes. China and India of about 6 weeks, Mexico of about 7 months. So a much bigger change, excuse me. And the general category, so everybody else outside of these main larger countries saw changes of about 6 weeks. Looking at our F2B, which is unmarried children aged 21 and older of U.S. green card holders, the changes were not so large. We saw much more incremental changes, only about a week for China, about a week for India, and as well for general category. The Philippines, once again, unfortunately did not see any change. Mexico did see a change of about 3 months and 1 week, so a little bit larger of a shift there. In general, unfortunately, the Philippines overall in the family-based categories did not see any movement. India, China, and Mexico all did. In general, Mexico's movement slightly larger. Pakistan moved with the rest of the country. So on the Visa Bulletin, the government singles out certain particular countries that are sources of more immigrants to the United States than others. So historically, that has been China, Mexico, India, and the Philippines. So when you're reading the Department of State Visa Bulletin, you'll notice general category or sometimes all others, and then it will say China, India, Mexico, and the Philippines. And so any country that is not China, India, Mexico, or the Philippines is going to fall into that all other general category. And so a country like Pakistan, Thailand, South Africa, they all would move in the general category. Everybody else, you're going to be in sort of the general column. In the case, though, often that is there's strength in numbers, let's put it that way. So, it was satisfying to see a bit of movement for most groups in the family-based category. But as I mentioned, we did see the Philippines not see any movement in family-based. And for F4, siblings of U.S. citizens, India did also not see any movement, though Mexico, China, and the rest of the world did see movement between 2 weeks and 5 weeks. So the Visa Bulletin, again, is exciting to see a little bit of movement. We're still current for the F2A, and the reporting from the State Department so far leads us to believe that that will probably remain true, at least for the next several months. The State Department is actively encouraging certain categories of employment-based immigrant visas to change categories into faster categories so they can expedite some of this process. And so to myself, my opinion is that that is an indication that they are still trying to move people more quickly through the process. And as long as that is true, they're going to keep the F2A current to facilitate people getting out of the NVC sort of backlog black hole and getting their immigrant visas and hopefully finally getting into the US with their green cards. Now, as I mentioned, the NVC backlog is going to be a bit of a hindrance to that. Really, the largest thing we can hope to see there is similar to the State Department. There is a serious staffing shortage for both offices. And recruiting and retaining people, as many of us know, we're all aware that labor shortages have become sort of a normal facet of life, both in the United States and it seems in other countries around the world as well. And so that's true at the State Department, unfortunately, as well. And so the time it takes to hire, train people so that we can start moving through this backlogs, unfortunately, we're just not really seeing the kind of aggressive movement that we need to see for there to be progress on these backlogs. And so, unfortunately, the grim note there that I have to end on is that as long as we're seeing these interview scheduling numbers stay pretty static at the NVC, these backlogs are going to remain a problem. And so for those of you who are waiting, I apologize that I don't have better news for you today. But the government does seem to be working somewhat towards this. They have rolled out new plans to reduce backlogs. They're working on increasing their budget towards moving some of these things. And so we're hoping that if we can get some traction, maybe we'll also start to see some policy changes that'll speed things up. So I am scrolling through, and we've been a little bit light on questions today. For those of you who are, it looks like, I'm going to give just a second here to see if anything comes through. But as far as F2A, as far as the NVC, like I said, I haven't really seen a whole lot of change. And unfortunately, I think that that's going to remain true, at least through the summer, which does tend to be a busier time for the Department of State in that many people are traveling, people are applying for visas of various sorts. And so generally we don't expect to see a decrease in backlogs during the summer. I hope that that will change as we move into the fall though. And as always, we will keep you posted whenever we learn more. Travel safely out there this summer. Enjoy your vacations if they're coming up. And everybody, I hope you have a wonderful day. Please check our website if you want some more information, and we'll be sure to post links to the articles I've been discussing today so y'all can go and check out the numbers for yourselves. Thanks so much, and have a lovely day, everybody.